the intent concept is this like thin layer of abstraction over all this like messy complexity, right? So basically it's supposed to be protocols like Across and Hyperlane, a bunch of others that handle all that messy stuff, and these solvers handling all the messy stuff. The user just says, I want to go from A to B, right? And do it fast. That is the vision. And the thing that's so cool about building this with all the other teams in the Ethereum space is...
Today's guests are Hart Lambur, co-founder of Across Protocol, and Nam Chu Hoai, the co-founder of Hyperlane. We are diving into all things Ethereum today as the recent Open Intents framework was released, and chances are a lot of people have questions about what this means, how it impacts builders and users in Ethereum, and more. With that said, Hart, welcome back on the show, and Nam, welcome to the show for the first time.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Jen.
Excited to have you guys here. And to start off, I briefly mentioned that the Open Intents framework announced by the Ethereum Foundation came into place, which is an initiative to make the ecosystem-wide interoperability, which I think is personally extremely important as someone who transacts on Ethereum. I have definitely had my fair share of difficulties. But before we get into that framework, can you two kind of explain what intents are at a base level and why do they even matter?
Nam, why don't we start with the problem statement here? Like what we're trying to do here. We can do this together, right? So problem statement.
Teamwork.
Statement. Teamwork. Bridge building here. The problem statement 4 years ago, Ethereum was had a hard time scaling. It just was slow and expensive. This is the framework that I think is useful. So Ethereum sucked at scalability. Vitalik's okay, we're going to solve scalability with rollup centric roadmap. And it took a few years, but it worked. 2024 was the year where a rollup was fast and cheap. On any individual rollup, you could have a Solana-like experience. But this introduced a new problem, which is this fragmentation. You now have 50, 100, 200 rollups, it can be more. And so Ethereum feels like this mess where you got to have, you got to know what chain you're on, you got to move tokens between the chains. It's just this it's kind of a horrendous UX. And so I think the urgent problem in Ethereum land now is how do we make this feel like one chain again? Make Ethereum great again by making it feel like it's one network again. And there's definitely a bunch of components to that. There's a bunch of wallet abstraction, chain abstraction type stuff. But one critical component is just simply being able to move assets between chains really quickly. That's it. We just simply want to be able to move assets between chains super fast. And my view, and I think Nam will agree, but my view is intents let us do that. And I'll tag team off to Nam. Nam, what do you think? Why are intents useful? What are we doing here?
Yes, I think intents are super useful. I think they are one of many tools, but honestly, one of the more important tools that we have to really facilitate that problem statement that Hart just mentioned, right? I think there's a lot, if we want to talk about general interop, I think we can speak hours about this. But the really core part is that I think for a lot of bridging of the underlying asset, to actually mint and burn a token on a rollup, right? That currently takes 7 days. And I think you see a lot of challenges that users and I think institutions face when dealing with that 7-day window. And so intents are a really nice way to basically offload that kind of duration risk, so to speak, from the users who generally don't want to think about that 7 days to professional entities, we call them solvers, to kind of do that job for them in exchange for a small fee, right? And so I think if people have used products like Across, Relay, DLN, I think that the experience is just super nice. You get to say hey, I want this asset on this chain, click send, you get the asset within 3, 5, 10 seconds. And I think that is, a much better user experience for being in the overall Ethereum ecosystem. And I think the challenge is just that we don't have it in enough places, right? I think many of these intent protocols, which again, I think Hart has really pioneered with Across, I think are still limited in where they are available. I think if you are on Optimism, Arbitrum, or Base, you will have access to those, users on those will have access to it. But right, like if we want to really take on the like Ethereum roadmap of like scaling via rollups, like we probably cannot rely on just like like a single protocol actually being available everywhere. And so the goal of the Intents framework kind of was born out of the like, hey, if I'm a new rollup, right, like launching today, whether that's for like a rollup as service or just like I launch my own rollup, like how do I get this intent experience? And that was kind of like the genesis idea of the framework.
So rollups were a 7-day window, right? And intents are now seconds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not bad.
Like not bad. The 7-day window is in one direction. Maybe you could say that like other non-intent bridges are maybe get to a minute. Circle CCTP is like 20 minutes between chains. But the across median fill time going between L2s is now 3 seconds, verging on 2 seconds. So it really is this like 2-second experience. That's what I'm targeting. And by the way, I kind of sometimes go around like shouting 2 seconds, but there's a reason for that. It's, you look at a lot of Google like Web 2 UX research, and they'll tell you that if a website takes more than 2 seconds to load, people just bounce. They like just close the tab and move on. And I think there's a psychological, it's just like a psychological barrier that human attention can kind of like wait 2 seconds for something. But as soon as you go past that, your mind wanders and you're on to the next thing. And so I actually think from just a pure usability perspective, we need to have this like 2-second interop between chains. And maybe just to like underline, potentially repeat a couple of Nam's points, but across can do this 2-second experience between Base and Arbitrum and Unichain and Optimism, but we can't do it everywhere in our current structure. And we want to be able to do it everywhere. And the open intent framework, and we'll probably get into how this all works, but the open intent framework lets intents go to all the corners of Ethereum, and ideally we'll let it go to all the corners of Ethereum on day one and permissionlessly. And so I get really bullish about that. And I think that's also what the Ethereum Foundation is really bullish about, because now we actually can accelerate intents and this 2-second speed experience getting everywhere.
Yeah. And when you say everywhere, is it the 30 plus teams that have committed to this framework, or is it literally everywhere because it's going to be open source and permissionless?
Yeah, I can add to that. So the idea of it is to be everywhere, right? Obviously, everywhere is like fundamentally super hard. Like I think that's maybe as for context for Hyperlane, right? Like we spend a lot of time on what we call long tail chains, basically, right? Like if you launch Jackie Chain,
Chain, I like that.
What is the relevant infrastructure, right, to get there? Would you care about as Jackie Chain? And one of the things you would care about is like, oh, how do users get to my chain? And so there's obviously like many ways of doing it. And I think the goal for Self-Intent Open Intents framework is just to have a like set of like open source code tools that kind of like allow you or somebody else to take this code and actually serve Jackie Chain, so to speak. And so it's meant as like a super modular kind of thing, and like people can customize it to their own needs. And I think the idea of like, some of the teams that kind of have like supported the Open Intents framework is that they can actually do so, right? Like if, like look at like Arbitrum's recently announced intent engine, right? Like they clearly say like, hey, we have this like set of like orbit L3s, and we want these L3s to have kind of the same intent experience. And right, like we've talked to a lot of teams like Arbitrum in that regard, right? Who basically kind of like have to reason about like, hey, what is our path here, right? Is our path like, like bugging hard to like just deploy everywhere? Is that like, right, like us building something in-house? And we've just talked with a lot of teams that honestly kind of build very similar things. Like there's some parts that are very similar, like, and then there's some parts that are going to be customized for their ecosystem, right? Whether that's, again, Arbitrums, whether it's the superchain of Optimism, whether that's Polygon with its ACK layer. Like there's a lot of like, I think really cool innovation that's happening at the interop layer for a lot of these ecosystems. And, I think as somebody who has done that for 3 years, there's too much. There's just too much for a single team to do. And so the hope for the Open Intents framework, and I think the reason why we have seen this kind of level of support is because people can kind of see its open and neutral nature to allow people to work on these kind of like shared abstractions that are going to be common among anybody who wants to have these kind of like intent experiences on their chain.
Mm-hmm. Nam, I know Hyperlane actually kickstarted the initiative with the initial funding. What was the decision behind that for you? If you could think back to that moment where you're like, we need to do this, and I'm gonna like be the first one to step out there and like throw my hat in the ring or throw Hyperlane in the ring to get this started.
Yeah, I think we spent a lot of time in the long tail of chains. Right? Like I think one of like I would say our key stakeholders is basically like, yeah, you launch a chain, and if you are like Monad, if you're not Barachain, like you can talk with the big interop providers and you can make a deal with the BD team about like how to get interop. And that is just not true for the long tail of chains. Maybe Jackie, I think your BD muscle is very good and you can find a way into those teams. But like, if you launch a roll up, you are just like, two dudes in like the Philippines or something, that's going to be much more challenging to you. And so as we've talked with these teams about how should they think about interop, right? Like Hyperlane serves like a particular part of interop very well for them, which is kind of like the message bridging and like minting of an asset. But when it comes to like providing an intent experience or something like an intent experience, that's just not possible. At least today, that requires people to build these kind of things on top of Hyperlane. And what we found is that there's these multiple teams who've kind of like said like, "Nah, I want this. You don't have it to me. So like, I will just build this myself." And so I saw a bunch of teams who started building basically intent protocols on top of Hyperlane. And the engineer in me just like kind of like screamed, was like, "Oh no, this is like so inefficient. Like all you guys are basically building the same thing." And like, it would be way better if like we had kind of a shared basis for which like you can now deploy that thing to your chain, or you can slightly customize this part of the intent protocol for your purposes. And so that's kind of how it was born. It was just like this idea of like, hey, if I make it easier, right, for the people who build on top of Hyperlane to get what they want, like that's going to be good for us. That's going to be good for them. It's going to be good for everybody, because now there's this like shared basis of open source tooling to bring intents everywhere. And so that was about, I would say, like 4 or 5 months ago. Been working with a team called Bootnote, who's been really great at kind of like pushing this forward. And yeah, I'm very happy to see kind of like how it's been able to, I think, kind of like give kind of like have people see how it can help them as well.
Mm-hmm. So prior to this, you're saying if you didn't have a contact to a BD person at a specific chain, like you might just have not been able to integrate with it?
I think if you were a chain, I'll try.
Yeah, it's just because Nam brought up the example of like, or he's used this of like getting across to go to your chain, right? And like Nam and I had this conversation a bit ago too. So across, we have this intense fast bridging, great. We wrote a standard for intents called ERC 7683 that I think maybe we talked about last time on this podcast.
Yes,
Jackie,
we did, yeah.
That we wrote that with Uniswap too. And that standard, the mental model is it specifies the shape of the order ticket of like what I want to do between chains, which is like a really useful standard to have everybody like writing their kind of order ticket in the same way. It's kind of like a common format for this like cross-chain transaction, if you will. And so that's all well and good, but we still needed a way to settle that intent. And the across settlement system that exists today is 2 years old. It's worked really well, but it doesn't let you permissionlessly add a chain to it, right? So Nam's example of 2 guys in the Philippines launch a chain, they'd have to be like, hey, across, we want to get added to this, go through our governance process, bunch of stuff. And that's just too much of a barrier, right? So this open intent framework, I look at it as a natural kind of extension of this 7683 standard, where we're now saying, okay, here's how you can also write settlement layers, which is what the 7683 standard always kind of contemplated in the first place. But now we're doing it, which is great. And now we can have anyone can kind of write a settlement layer for their intent system that could be permissionless, could have different trust assumptions, could work in a different way. And it'll let intents just go everywhere. And I love this from a Cross's perspective, because now we can begin to route orders. to those different settlement systems, and it can make our product better by like just letting us serve more chains more quickly.
Yeah. I think also that shared effort across the ecosystem is just so important and so valuable. I see you two nodding, so I'm obviously saying something right here. But even as a user, I'm not a builder in this space, but I have, my own user experiences, especially within the Ethereum ecosystem. And I was talking about it before we even started recording that like the other day I had to do a transaction and it took me like I had to bridge from I think it was USDC on ETH and get it over to Base. And then you have to make sure that you're getting the right token and then the address. And it's like, I've been in this space for so long. And like, I still find it to be difficult to transact in the ecosystem. And it should be seamlessly available. And that fragmentation is just like, I think a result of, a lot of excited teams and a lot of people building. But what if we just like pulled it all back together in a way that, to both your points, makes it more seamless, right? Like what would be possible then?
Yeah. The intent concept is this like thin layer of abstraction over all this like messy complexity, right? So basically it's supposed to be protocols like Across and Hyperlane, a bunch of others that handle all that messy stuff, and these solvers handling all the messy stuff. The user just says, I want to go from A to B, right? And do it fast. And so that is the vision. And the thing that's so cool about building this with all the other teams in the Ethereum space is everybody does have something to contribute here. And like, we just kind of got to point in the same direction. So the Ethereum Foundation is saying, hey, everybody, we need fast bridging between all the chains, and we need it everywhere. And like, we agree, right? I certainly agree. So we need that. Intents are the only viable way we can do that anytime soon. So let's use intents. We have this standard that like Across and Uniswap wrote that people generally like for how we like specify an intent, but we need a little bit more like framework around that too. And the open intent framework is like the more of the scaffolding around how we can do that in a way that benefits like all the players. Now, if you're Superchain and you're working on like Superchain native interop, or the Optimism working on Superchain native interop, this framework benefits you too, because you can be like, okay, we're gonna like, and Across is doing this, writing like a 7683 settlement layer with Superchain that's going to allow really fast and even cheaper intents between Base and Unichain. And Polygon can contribute with the ARA-EG layer, and Arbitrum can contribute with their open intent framework. There's another new startup, T1, that wants to build a TEE-based settlement system. And then we got Hyperlane, we've got Wormhole, Axelar, all these other teams too can all kind of contribute in their part. And I think that just gets us to the end state faster.
What would you two say are the key features to this intents framework that maybe differs from previous ones?
I'm not sure I was aware of previous ones, because honestly, I would prefer not to do this.
Sorry, I mean like previous like interoperability initiatives, I should say.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Yes.
not previous frameworks of this that never existed. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think we had the EF Interop day here in Denver yesterday, and I think as the Ethereum ecosystem, I think it's kind of interesting to observe two things, right? Like one, I think is just a general desire for innovation and research and kind of like improving things, right? Like I think we've like Ethereum just said like, hey, we do rollups, and then rollup teams went around like out there and just said like, okay, cool, we're building rollups, right? And obviously we saw a lot of diverse ways of doing it: optimistic rollups, CK rollups, like now based rollups. And I think that's really what Ethereum is really good at, is like, hey, like right, like a lot of different teams do research and kind of bring that research to market. But I think what Ethereum also has kind of seen with interop specifically is a lot of attempts at kind of like standardization of like interop, so that like we can actually all like be interoperable with each other as we're doing this kind of like roll up innovation. And I think it's maybe easy to be very I don't know, like frustrated, I guess, with like how that has been in the past. And there's like probably legitimate concerns around like, oh, is this just another one of those where like we do something and then it fizzles out? I think that's I think there's no, like, it would be naive to think that like it just like happens. I think Ethereum is a very diverse and broad ecosystem, which means there's a lot of stakeholders and therefore a lot of opinions to be had about like what something like this should look like. But I think really the difference, I think, this time around is, or at least like what I like as different this time around, is that it just meant as like, hey, here's open source code that you can use. I think previously a lot of standards were kind of like, just like bogged down in like, oh, let's talk about the standard, let's talk about the interface, let's discuss this kind of like to death. And I think it's just like hard to do that. And I think what I really liked about like Hart and Uniswap's like 7683 standard was like, hey, right, like we are pushing this forward, right? Like we are providing kind of like, we'll add this to a protocol, we'll specify this, and people can basically like do exactly the same thing, right? Like instead of just like, I've seen in my last 3 years of interop, and even before that, seen many standards who just kind of say like, oh, all we have to do is specify an interface and then the rest will come. But I think realistically speaking, what is really necessary is for people to actually provide code and help to teams who want to implement a standard. Because I think just having, an ERC that like you don't help people and teams to actually adopt, I think it's going to be a much harder time.
Yeah. I also know the Open Intents framework complements across protocols recent 7683 contracts. Hart, can you kind of dive into that further and on how that works? Because it was released on mainnet, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. What's the playbook for building a standard that people actually use, right? I don't know that there is a playbook. We're figuring this out as we go along, but what's the step here? Okay, Across did intents in our own way. Like we built a product, it works. It's what you can go use today. And it works pretty well and people like it, which makes me happy. We said there's components of our system that are better done as a standard that other people can use. Namely the shape of our order ticket and our solver network. We want our solver network. Our solver network is better the more order flow in it. There'll be more solvers, which means like intents will just work better. So we want our solver network to almost be like a public good where it's getting tons of order flow from tons of sources. So we created the standard with Uniswap, and we are now in the process of implementing it in our own protocol. So what you're talking about here is we've deployed 7683 compatible contracts to mainnet that you can go and use. Like I did a brief demo, and I got to put some more Twitter content out there, but I did a demo where you go on like Etherscan on Base, so on Basescan, and literally click in the contract to like send intent, and it shows up on Arbitrum. And it took in my demo, it took 1 second to do that, which is like
half the second.
Pretty cool.
Half the 2 seconds.
yeah. No.
50% 50%
improvement.
Yeah, 50% improvement. That's the math. You guys are the scientists.
But like, so it's like pretty cool. Like you can go and do this as something that people can build on. And we're like, okay, we're putting this into mainnet for people to use. To reiterate what like Nam was just saying though, is like the standard, he's right in that you don't just define this like spec and expect that it's just going to get adopted. It doesn't quite work that way. You got to like write code and you got to like help people actually implement it. And like in a certain sense, Nam kind of beat us to it, but I think it's better. Like this open intent framework, it's better that it's a third party doing it because it just means we got like, it's more neutral. It doesn't feel like an Across or Uniswap thing. It's truly something that like Ethereum is pushing. And it's something that like, Across is leaning into. This is great for us because we're just going to have more teams that are excited about this standard and actually make it real. And then, my aim is like, we just kind of become the 7683 protocol and we have all these teams that we can use their 7683 components to get really fast interop all over the place faster than we could ourselves.
Yeah. What were the conversations like with the Ethereum Foundation surrounding this? I know We tried having them join this, but they couldn't make it. And so I feel like you guys definitely had conversations with the team. And this is something that they wanted alleviated as well, for the ecosystem's sake. So I'm curious, like, if there's anything you could share on that front.
I mean, I think it is interesting how interacting with the Ethereum Foundation. So like you go on Twitter. Can you go on Twitter and complain about something? Maybe that works. Maybe it doesn't. Right?
Maybe. Yeah.
Maybe. But I was able to get in front of Vitalik like 6-ish months ago and be like, look, like this interop thing is a problem. Intents has this fast solution.
Mm-hmm.
It is compatible and complementary to the interop efforts that many other teams are doing. So like the good example is like AgLayer and like Superchain. Like those work in their own kind of domains, but they don't work everywhere. So it's like this intent layer, sort of this abstraction layer on top. And, we talked to some people at the EF and like, yeah, that makes sense. And then I think Nam's done a great job talking with Josh Rudolph at the EF, who's really been a true kind of like community organizer, trying to like get a lot of people's opinions. And he's done a great job of just being like, okay, what are the common components that are credibly neutral that we can get a bunch of Ethereum teams behind? And, I don't know, Nam, what do you want to add there? I feel like they've done
I think
good job.
I think I started talking with Josh since Bangkok. And honestly, I think part of the reason why he's not here is because his job is super fucking hard. Like he has to talk with.
He's here like, physically in the universe, but not on this call. Yes.
Yes, he's spiritually here because like what he has to do is like everybody be on Twitter after I think especially like the last couple of months where like Solana has been picking up steam, right? Everyone's like, oh, like Ethereum is too fragmented, like Ethereum is like dunzo, and like why is the EF not doing something? And I think Josh is the guy that like at the EF who's supposed to do something, and that do something just means like talk with a lot of people and trying to kind of like get everybody kind of like not even on the same page, but just like not like further diverging. And I have like huge respect for I think what Josh has been able to do so far, and hopefully what we can do more on. And I think it's definitely if you're Josh and like a couple of months into now having to solve Ethereum interop, which is like the hardest task out there that I could imagine. I think it was definitely like it was very refreshing to kind of like see like his like him listening to kind of like all the different stakeholders, seeing kind of like, hey, what are some good approaches? What are some neutral approaches that allow us to make progress now, right? While kind of like leaving plenty of optionality down the road to kind of like improve upon, right? Like interop later, right? Like I think what we're saying here is not that like intents will solve everything or that interop is solved with something like the intents framework, but it's just like a good first step in the right direction. And there's like so many other like efforts, right? Like around like message standardization or like, right? Like shared storage proofs that like we can all do to ultimately make the like underlying interop better. But that's probably just going to take more time. And like, I think really I think the ecosystem has clearly spoken that like, hey, this needs to be solved today. And so being able to bring the ecosystem together and kind of like find concrete steps that we can take to like actually make bridging with intents, like kind of like live, hopefully within the next 6 months, right? Ideally, really the next 3 months, is really like, I think, I would say great job by Josh.
Yeah. What do you think is the next step then? First, this intents within 3-6 months, maybe. But then what? Like, what do you two see as like a very pressing topic or area that also needs to be tapped into next?
Well, okay, 2 questions in there, maybe. Like concretely, like what's happening, I think, with this open intent framework next. So we have teams write 7683 compatible settlement layers that are in production. And then we have the ability, like what I want Across to do is then we have the ability to route to these settlement layers, and other protocols are going to be routing that to them too. Right. So we literally just get intents. My personal goal is I want like intents everywhere by Easter, which isn't maybe quite going to happen, but like,
when's Easter? April?
I don't know. It moves. It's one of those.
My Catholic mother would kill me.
Yeah, it's bad, right? I say Easter, but I have no idea, right? It's like, anyway, sorry. Just it's just a nice holiday.
Easter,
right?
when Jesus
Easter.
rises.
Who doesn't like Easter bunnies?
That's a company deadline, yes.
If we don't know what it is, it's blurred. So we want intents everywhere as soon as we can. And my goal is like, can I move Ethereum in a few seconds to a new chain that just launched? Right. I like that being like a North Star that we get to. And I honestly think we can make very quick progress on that in the next few months, because we are aligning a bunch of teams to work in the common direction.
Yeah.
Your other part of your question is like, what else do we need to make Ethereum feel like one chain again? Maybe
that's a big question.
Yeah. And I think that's where it goes into more of this like chain abstraction kind of domain. How do I make my wallet? Maybe my wallet doesn't even exist. I just want to like click buttons and I'm using chains and it's spending money from somewhere else. And I don't even know, I don't have to think about it. Right. That I think there's lots and lots of work to do. But there is also good progress. Like there's this account abstraction framework called 7702 that's coming out with the Pectra hard fork, which I think is going to be exciting. And then there's more work going on there too.
Yeah. Now, what's your take?
Remember trying to move your assets between chains, watching the minutes tick by, wondering if your transaction would make it? Yeah, we've all been there. But here's the thing. While other bridges feel like taking the scenic route, Across is your express lane. Base, Arbitrum, Optimism, boom, boom, boom. Your assets move between them faster than you could say cross-chain. Across isn't just another bridge. When Uniswap needed the fastest, most reliable way to move assets cross-chain, they chose Across. Now millions of Uniswap users are swapping between chains without even thinking about it, because that's how it should be. Whether you're moving assets yourself or building the next big thing in crypto, Across makes cross-chain feel like the same chain. No more scenic routes, no more complexity, just 2-second transfers between chains. Ready to join the Express Lane? Head to across.to and experience what bridging should have been all along.
Yeah, I think to echo, I think Hart's first point, the goal, right? Like, I think what's been really nice is to have this, I would say, social support of kind of like the community to, right, like be like, hey, yes, we all care about getting intents as fast as many places, and to open intents forever is a great way of doing that. I think that, like the important part now is to actually follow up that with action, right? Like, I think talk with the OPs and polygons of the world of like, hey, here is how you can get intents into your ecosystem, right? Here is how, right? Like one thing that we discussed on the intents working group yesterday was cool. Like, what's necessary for a new chain is to even just know what are the steps involved to get intents, right? Like part of it is this kind of like technical part of like, hey, how do I deploy these contracts? How do I like choose from different settlement contracts from my chain? But also, right, like part of it is going to be like, where do I find these solvers, right? Like I need a solver to support my chain, and like, right, like maybe you have a directory of solvers that kind of like offer their services, right? Like maybe it is like actually just making it easier for the chain themselves to run a solver to kind of facilitate the user experience for their chain. And so I think what we talked about a lot is kind of like having these playbooks basically for these different stakeholders to make it easy to, right, like to basically like literally spell it out for them. This is how you get intents to your chain, right? It is talking to the like relevant stakeholders like the solvers, right? And be asking them, hey, what do you need to support more chains, right? Like what do you need to kind of like make the extent experience better, right? Like part of it is going to be, how do I as a solver rebalance across all of these chains, right? Like I think doing that on like Optimism and Arbitrum Base, Binance supports all of these. You can probably quickly rebalance through Binance, but like as you get to more long tail chains, that becomes a lot harder. And that's part of the reason why we haven't seen intent experiences on a new chain. And so I think it's just a matter of actually kind of like, there's just like the boring answer is always like, you just got to chip away at all the building, like the bottlenecks of like what prevents intents from being on those chains right now. And the idea is like, if we do that together, I think we're going to be able to do that faster. We're going to be able to have more places. And so I think that's a concrete next step with the open intents framework, is to just get people engaged in terms of actually deploying these things and identifying the bottlenecks for them. And then, I think it's not even that it's like comes after, but I think that that doesn't prevent, right, like other exciting opportunities of like products to be built that kind of like either built with intents, built next to intents, outside of intents, right? Like I think Hart mentioned, sorry, I'm blanking. Hart mentioned chain abstraction, and right, like there's things like right, like resource locks that are really cool that like take away the finalization risk of solvers that like intents cheaper. There's right like shared proof systems to make like the rebalancing of the underlying assets faster. There's going to be like there's going to be way too many. Again, I think as somebody who has like been in Interop for quite a while, there's so many teams working on Interop, and so this is definitely not meant as like the only way of like improving Interop experience. This is one very important way of doing so. But I think there's a lot of different approaches can be done very complementary to the open intents framework, and I'm like very excited to see this kind of like coordinated effort from many different stakeholders to come together.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to come first from like core development teams, or it would be individual builders in the space that are going to really like tap into this intents framework? I feel like those are separate categories, right?
They kind of are. I think what's kind of nice about this is I think it's going to be the core teams writing what I'm calling the settlement layer. So the settlement, again, I keep saying this, but it's like where the user funds get escrowed and only released to the solver after we verify the intent was filled. I think that's probably going to be core teams that are doing that. But what's interesting is solvers themselves are like in across, solvers are a permissionless function that anyone can come and do. And it's a lot of like guys in their basement, like night and weekend projects that fill across. And, you know, there's kind of this meme out there that it's like just Wintermute filling intents on across, which is like entirely untrue. I don't think Wintermute actually touches across too. It's a bunch of like kind of random builders that like being part of this infrastructure and kind of like competing to see if they can actually fill more order flow than the next guy. So it's almost like it's this framework where everybody's got something to contribute, and that's kind of by design, where all these different teams can like contribute their specialty, and I like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. This might be a silly question for you too, but and maybe Nam, you'll just say it's because I didn't think of it sooner, but why wasn't this made sooner?
You know, I always tell Hart like my only way know-how is to build frameworks. Like I think I just like as an engineer just like love the idea. Like I think kind of my like two great examples of that are like Kubernetes and Next.js, because right like I think this idea of just like, hey, instead of all of us building the same thing, let's you know, build kind of the shared thing and then we can customize it or deploy it ourselves. I just love this idea. That's basically how we've built Hyperlane, right? The idea is that, hey, you can right like yes, like you could be building your own message protocol, right? Or if you were like a new chain and like, you know, you're sick of like trying to get the DTMs off these other chains, like what are your options? I mean, there were until Hyperlane really just like, yeah, I got to build it myself. Like I think IBC is really like the only other permissionless messaging protocol that you can take. And so for me, it was always clear, like, yeah, like you're going to be able to reach way more people by having an open source framework, right? Like people, like instead of moving from this kind of like service provider relationship to a like, hey, here's open source code. Like I'm not beholden to right like a central party that tells me whether I get Interop or not, was just like naturally the only way that I could see like the rollups like centric roadmap really succeeding. And so I think I've been right like that's basically been the basis of like Hyperlane for the last 3 years. And I do think it's not like a super common view, I guess. And so I think obviously like a lot of crypto projects are open source, but like I think there's a difference between, I would say, like open source code and I think a framework, right? Like you as a framework, you have to actually make it easy. You have to actually make it accessible for people to like deploy this independently from the core team. And I think that's something that honestly, as a crypto industry in general, I think there's been probably less focus on that kind of developer experience of like, hey, if you are, again, just two dudes in the Philippines, like what's realistically the chance that you can deploy, you know, like I think these things, right? Like Uniswap was a great example, right? Like Uniswap was simple and easy enough that people could just deploy Uniswap clones on all the EVM chains all the time. And I think the rubber meets the road for frameworks where where you can actually show that people can deploy these things themselves. And I think that's just a skill that honestly is just not something that I guess has been valued super much. And so, yeah, hopefully the Open Intents Framework and Hyperlane itself are going to be great counterexamples to that.
Yeah. Hart, what do you think?
I mean, I'll tell you like kind of how the sausage is made. Like,
please.
6 months ago, like Nam's like, hey, can we get across on these chains that like Hyperlane supports, right? And we're like, man, like, we got a lot going on, right? Maybe, right? And from our perspective, just internally, it's like, okay, what are our priorities here? Like, we want to, add Solana support and add all this stuff, or do we want to turn our across system into a framework? Like, do we want to invest in that? And from where we were sitting for our customers, where like who was actually using across, it's more important for us to add like the major chains. That was like, I think that's kind of true. From where Nam's sitting, he's like, my bread and butter are these long tail chains, and I need a solution for them. And so this is where there's like a pretty nice partnership where Nam goes and like builds the framework for the long tail chains in a way that like wasn't our top priority, even though we think it's a really good idea. It's just we had to service our users who are like, we need chain XYZ ASAP. And then we're all better off for it. So that's kind of why, we were trying to focus on serving our customer first and foremost, and Nam was trying to focus on serving his customer first and foremost, and they didn't exactly align. And now maybe they're coming together, which is cool.
Yeah, I think.
What do you think?
I think.
You agree?
Yeah, I want. Yeah, no, I totally. I mean, as somebody who has been,
do you guys ever disagree? Come on.
Well, we do disagree on a lot. There's like some trust assumption stuff. There's sort of like, I think we did disagree about how, intent. There's a bunch of stuff we disagree on. But on the intent stuff, I think we're like, this is cool and useful. We should put it everywhere. Anyways, no, I might cut you off.
Yeah, sorry. I did.
No, we have, plenty of, it's funny. I think when 7683 first came out, I think one of the complaints that I had, I think that it was probably also widely shared, is right. I think, the idea of 7683 was to, modularize out the settlement contract so that, different settlement systems can basically plug in. And it's not just like across this UMA-based settlement, but there's certainly I think technical trade-offs to be had about how expressive or not expressive is that interface, and how much complexity do you take on to actually make it easier for solvers to integrate and reason about the security of these settlement systems. And so not to get too much into that, I think there's definitely plenty of disagreement that Hart and I've had, and also the over the past year I've been begging Hart, please, I don't want to build this. Just get across to all of these different chains. And I think the reality is that I think when you build obviously a company, a protocol, you have to decide what you prioritize, what you focus on, right? You can't actually do all of it, and you have to have a strategy by which you serve your customers, so to speak. And I think it totally makes sense, right? Especially from when Across started, which was I think 2 years ago. 3 years ago? Well,
2.5, 3.
2.5 years ago, right? It was hey, there is 10 chains right now, right? And so let's focus on a settlement system that serves those 10 chains really well. And I think really it was over the last year, right, where this kind of roll-up centric roadmap has actually come to fruition, where Hyperlane's live on 130 chains, right? I expect tens of thousands of chains going to be out there. And that just is fundamentally going to be a different approach of how you kind of go to market than there was previously. Right? I think the same thing you see with block explorers, right? I think previously it was well, you got to get Etherscan, right? And now obviously it's going to be very hard for Etherscan to scale to hundreds of chains. And you see kind of most new blockchains launch with Block Scout, right? Unless you're Unichain, you obviously get both. But I think there's a bunch of these kind of infrastructure pieces, Interop included, which I think you will, at least that's our thesis at Hyperlane, that you will see just a different mode of serving this kind of long tail. And I think it comes ultimately a question of, do you believe in I think the Cosmos people always call this the app chain thesis, right? Of where will applications live, right? Will applications live on Base? successful applications eventually do what Unichain did and basically launch their own blockchain and be able to customize that block space. And I think in that latter world, like I think just infrastructure pieces need to be a lot more permissionless to allow these teams to actually do this. Otherwise, they will always be bogged down in this kind of like BD battle of like, oh, I need to talk to this team to get a bridge. I need to talk to this team to get a block explorer. I need to talk to this team to get an Oracle. And so I think hopefully, right, like Hyperlane and an open tense framework is just going to be the start of, I think many frameworks that are serving this kind of like explosion of rollups. And yeah, again, Blockscott is not a great example.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I think there's a lot to come from that too. Once it's all said and done though, what types of use cases and initiatives are you too excited to see kind of like pan out?
Once interoperability solved, you say?
Once interoperability solved, we'll be driving flying cars in the sky and everything.
Solved by Easter. We're solving it by Easter.
Yes, there we go.
No, but Jackie, like I think again, like if all these chains felt like one network, and the user experience gets better. So we get intents everywhere, which is like this building block. So we now have this 2-second ability to send value and messages between chains. Then there is still more UX work on like the wallet type interface of how we make this all feel like one chain. But we have a core component building block, which is this 2-second experience between all the chains. Okay. I think what ends up happening is we have a world where you could have thousands or millions of chains, but like Jackie, you don't want to put your money on millions of chains. That would be like the most painful thing alive.
That's
right?
Crazy. Yeah.
So like it's crazy. I think you have your money on 1 or 2 or maybe 5 chains, something like that. And you can spend your money on any chain and do whatever action you want. So like I'm clicking buttons on another chain, but paying for it from this chain over here.
Right.
That's quite different from what people think of bridging today. But like, that's what bridging could be. Bridging could be like moving a fraction of a penny to go execute this call on this other chain that I pay for from like my home chain, if you will. And so that's like one use case that could emerge where you just have like gazillions of these cross-chain intents that are just, your standard transaction because there's 10 million chains and you don't want to put your money on all of them. But generally speaking, it's just like, it's this ability to send these micropayments with instructions, with actions between this million chains that we're going to have. I don't know, Nam, what do you got to say?
Yeah, I guess my mental model, or maybe like an analogy I usually use here is that like think of right like your wallet, right? Like maybe being like like literally a wallet of cash that you like hold at home or whatever. But then when you go to a store, you basically have like in a store that's being like another chain, right? Like you have to basically find a way to like fund your like that store wallet with cash, and you have to bridge basically that cash over to the store wallet, right? And I think just making that bridging experience of like getting right like funds in your store wallet, like that's what we're focusing on for the next 3 to 6 months, right? That's what I would call the intense part. But like really what we want to get to, right, is that like you just have a credit card, and right like each of these stores have like, the different applications. You just go to them, you give them your credit card, and the underlying system, right, like figures out, oh cool, like right like this is a credit card at like Bank of America, like right like the interchange system figures out how to actually pull the funds and gives that to the merchant, right? There's like insurance and all this kind of stuff behind it. But you, as a user, you don't, obviously, nobody ever thinks about how credit cards work, right? Like they just give card, you get stuff. Like honestly, that's one of the magical things about capitalism is that like you just have a plastic card and you get stuff. And I think that's really what we want from, right? Like I think people who build applications is that like, you just like give wallet, it does the thing for you. And you don't have to think about like where your cash is and how to bridge it. And oh shit, I forgot like my cash in this other store wallet, so let me go there and bridge it back. And so it's kind of like, unified balance, like seamlessly use of applications without those applications having to even like think about this. I think that's going to be the end game that I think is going to be super exciting.
Yeah, it's huge. I think one of my last questions for you too is we talked about kind of all of the zeitgeist online about people talking poorly about the Ethereum ecosystem and whatever. You know what I'm talking about, just kind of like the banter out there about like the fragmentation and everything. Do you see kind of a future where this 180s, and people are actually talking about now with this framework and maybe others in the pipeline, that it is a good experience and that like that joke won't land.
Yeah. I mean, like, look, Ethereum
Nam's laughing.
Ethereum is more scalable than Solana. That's my take, right? And I like Solana, by the way. I'm not actually a hater, but some people are. Like, fundamentally, you want more scale on Ethereum, you add another rollup, right? And it's like kind of infinitely scalable. There are some nuances here. We've got to scale blob space. There's stuff like that too. But like there's a path there, and we're like real progress has been made. So I really actually think the rollup centric architecture is a brilliant way to scale a blockchain so that anyone can launch a blockchain like you launched a website in like 2002, right? It's just click a button and it's done.
Right.
And so I think that's really powerful. If we can have that degree of scalability, but this intent interop thing makes it just all feel like one network, that feels like the better, more powerful experience. And that's where I think like Ethereum really, really wins when we deliver that. And like we're gonna do it by Easter, so let's go.
By Easter.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite saying is that like most disagreements in crypto are just like a difference in like revealed time horizon, right? Like it's basically depends like how far do you think. And I think if you think, I think on the order of 6 months, honestly, like like Ethereum and its rollups are just going to be like a more fragmented experience than Solana, right? But then if you think about like years ahead, basically of like, hey, what is going to be an actual ecosystem that can, right, like serve everything? I mean, obviously it gets murkier and like it's like just like hard to predict like that long of the future. But I think that's where I think the rollup centric roadmap, like Hart said, has I think a lot of strengths because I think it is able to serve more use cases at a scalable way, possibly at least than like I think more centralized, but like I think more monolithic approaches, I guess. And I think this is honestly exactly the same thing, right? That you play out in like Web 2 with like databases or something, right? Like I think there was always this notion of like, oh, you can just have a a single database and just vertically scale it super well, and that can serve like all use cases. And then some people believe like, oh yeah, maybe for some, but not for all, right? And obviously like database world today is not definitely just like a single database that runs, but it's actually like many, many different databases. And so making those interoperable, I think seems like clearly necessary. And so I think, with this kind of difference in time horizon, what really matters ultimately is, right, like how do you time that to the market, right? Like I do think right now, probably it was a bit of a late of a time for Ethereum to have thought about interop. That probably would have been all easier if we did this like 2 years ago. And right, like we have the surge of kind of like, new users coming to crypto. And just like, if you're a new user to crypto, it's very clear what is easier today, right? And like, I do think Solana obviously has plenty of block space that can serve a lot of applications. And so as a developer and as a user, it might make sense to actually do Solana. But then, right, like if you think about like, hey, actually I'm here for the next 5 years, and like, I don't know that like Solana can scale to what I need it to, then that's a different story. And that's where people, I think, still see, I think, a lot of the value in, I think, the Ethereum kind of like neutrality and the Ethereum scalability of the rollups. And so I think like definitely, I think that like, negative sentiment on Twitter of like, oh, Ethereum is done, it's definitely way overblown. But there's like a lot of work that has to happen to actually make the rollup centric roadmap work. And I think Interop is a key part. Josh at DF is doing kind of like, amazing work to kind of like point us all in the right direction. And so I'm very excited to see, what we'll have by Easter.
Easter. Not 2 Easters ago, not last Easter, this Easter, not next Easter. This one. Amazing. Well, Hart, Nam, thank you so much for coming on today and talking all about the open intents framework. Super interesting. Excited to see what happens.
Thanks, Jackie. Let's go unify Ethereum by Easter.
Thanks, Jackie.
Happy Easter.